On the 25th of March 1903, a single shot rang out in room 105 at the Hotel Regina in Paris. When alarm staff entered the room, they found a 50-year-old lying dead with a gunshot wound to his head. He was a brave, talented British Army officer, the son of a humble crofter who'd enlisted in the army and had risen from the very bottom to become a major general in the class-ridden Victorian army. And yet, it had all ended here, in humiliation, a whiff of conspiracy, and above all, sadness. I've wanted to tell this story for some time, and I'm really grateful to all of you who've requested it. This is the inspiring and sad story of Major General Sir Hector MacDonald, Fighting Mac. Hector Archibald MacDonald was born in March 1853, not far from Dingwall in Ross-shire, in the very far northeast of Scotland. His father, William, was a crofter and also a stonemason, or what they'd call a dry diker, someone who constructed stone walls for farms and for houses. And it was during his itinerant travels as a dry diker that William met Anne Boyd. They married, and Anne was to give birth to 5 boys, the youngest of whom was Hector. Dingwall and the surrounding remote areas of Scotland were Gaelic speaking, and the crofters, like the MacDonald family, were survivors from the Highland clearances, which was still within living memory. Young Hector helped at the croft with his family, and then helped his family earn much needed cash by working for the junior baillie, a sort of a local government officer at Dingwall, Mr. Robertson. Once Robertson returned home to find young Hector mounted on his pony, galloping around the field, wielding a fork like a sword and giving orders to an imaginary army. It seems that Hector MacDonald had a military calling from a very young age. Despite that, when he was 15, he was apprenticed to a draper in Dingwall. The military would have to wait, but not for long. In 1879, when 3 days after his 17th birthday, young Hector joined the Inverness-shire Highland Rifle Volunteers, and a year later, lying about his age and walking out on his five-year apprenticeship contract, he signed on as a full-time soldier with the 92nd Regiment of Foot, the Gordon Highlanders. The 92nd had an illustrious fighting record, where they famously joined the charge of the Scots Greys at the Battle of Waterloo. These fiery fighting Highlanders were so keen to get at Napoleon's troops, they actually hung onto the stirrups of the Scots Greys as they charged into the enemy. Within 2 years, before he was even 20, MacDonald had been promoted to sergeant. His commanding officer called him into his office to inform him of the promotion, and told him in no uncertain terms that a sergeant in an illustrious regiment like the 92nd, the Gordons, was, in his opinion, equivalent to being a member of the British Parliament. MacDonald swiftly moved upwards, becoming one of the youngest colour sergeants in the British Army at the time. In December 1878, the 26-year-old colour sergeant and the rest of the 92nd were dispatched to Afghanistan during the Second Anglo-Afghan War. On the 28th of September 1879, MacDonald played a key role in leading his Highlanders, along with a detachment of Sikh soldiers from India, up a steep slope, scattering 2,000 Afghan soldiers outside the fort at Karataga. A relatively minor action in the overall war, the British commander in Afghanistan, General Frederick Roberts, mentioned MacDonald in dispatches. It was the first of 11 occasions that Hector MacDonald would be mentioned in dispatches during his military career. A few days later, MacDonald once again distinguished himself at the Battle of Charasiab, where one of the 92nd's officers, Major George White, was awarded the Victoria Cross. This is the same George White who, as a Major General, commanded the besieged garrison at Ladysmith during the Boer War. More importantly for our story, General Roberts also offered Colour Sergeant MacDonald the choice of a Victoria Cross or an officer's commission. And MacDonald chose the latter. And so this crofter's son rose from the ranks into the officer class that was dominated by sons of aristocrats, the majority of whom had simply purchased their commissions. MacDonald, now a subaltern, and the rest of the 92nd joined Roberts as he marched his army 310 miles in 20 days across the Afghan terrain from Kabul to defeat the Afghans decisively at Kandahar in 1880. A year later, MacDonald and the 92nds now found themselves in the Battle of Majuba in South Africa during the First Boer War. 3 companies of the 92nd, soon to be renamed the Gordon Highlanders, along with 2 companies of the 58th Regiment of Foot, later the Northamptons, with whom my dad served, were ordered by the General Sir George Coley to seize the steep hill of Majuba in Natal. MacDonald climbed the hill. He established a position for his Highlanders on the west side of the summit of Majuba. The Boers, however, stormed the mountain, and despite fierce resistance, not least from the Gordons, the British were driven off the top of the hill, losing just under 300 men killed, wounded or captured. Among those captured was MacDonald. The officer from the ranks had fought so ferociously that a highly impressed Boer general, Piet Joubert, actually returned MacDonald's sword to him afterwards, and shortly thereafter MacDonald was released from captivity. By 1885 he was once again in Africa, joining the British officered Egyptian army and participating in the unsuccessful efforts to rescue General Charles Gordon in Khartoum. Rising to the rank of captain, he was chosen to forge Sudanese recruits from the Mahdi's regime into a fighting force within the Egyptian army. Within a year, the soldier's soldier was once again leading troops into combat, this time at the Battle of Toski, where the Egyptian army, along with their Sudanese recruits, devastated an invading army from the Islamic State of Sudan. With an amazing track record already, MacDonald's real fame was to arrive with Kitchener's invasion of Sudan in the late 1890s. His well-disciplined, well-trained African troops performed admirably alongside regular British soldiers at the battles of Abu Hamed and at Atbara as they cleared away towards the Caliphate capital of Omdurman on the banks of the River Nile. The British press found in the no-nonsense common soldier from the Highlands a hero for their readers, and swiftly MacDonald was dubbed Fighting Mac. The final showdown with the Mahdi's successor, the Khalifa's Sudanese army, occurred outside their capital at Omdurman on the 2nd of September 1898. The Islamic army swept across the plain towards Kitchener's positions. In a withering barrage of artillery and rifle fire, they almost ceased to exist. After a brief pause in which Kitchener decided that he had given his enemy, quote, a good dusting, Kitchener resumed his advance on the capital at Omdurman. With his British units in the vanguard, followed by Egyptians, and in the rear MacDonald's sort of Sudanese-Egyptian command. MacDonald was slightly to the right of this advancing army, meaning that any attack from the hills alongside them would leave his men highly exposed. And the attack did indeed come. The Black Flag division of the Khalifa's giant army swept onto the plain towards Kitchener's marching column. Meanwhile, MacDonald, out on the field at the end, brought his 3 battalions of the Sudanese troops, the Sudanese 9th, 10th and 11th, at right angles to the advancing Black Flag, creating a crossfire. He left his battalion of Egyptians facing the Kerreri Hills, just in case there was another attack coming from another direction, so he sort of formed an inverted L. Kitchener turned his army out of the march to meet the new threat, and with MacDonald's command positioned at right angles, they created a devastating crossfire, destroying the brave but lightly armed Sudanese army. As MacDonald watched the remnants of the Black Flag column streaming back towards Omdurman, another huge force, the Green Flag column, came out from those Kerreri Hills straight towards the rear of MacDonald's isolated position. Only his Egyptian battalion was facing them. It was now that Hector MacDonald came into his own. The nearest Sudanese battalion pivoted and turned completely to come alongside their Egyptian comrades, and MacDonald swiftly brought the other 2 battalions alongside them. This parade-like manoeuvre, conducted in the midst of a battle, was pulled off just in the nick of time. With his whole brigade firing as rapidly as their Martini Henry rifles would allow, they managed to stop the Green Flag advance just 300 yards from their line. When the smoke cleared, MacDonald's men had each fired off 60 rounds, and some of them only had 2 rounds left in their pouches. Despite the closeness of the attack, MacDonald's Sudanese command had performed their desperate manoeuvre with no hint of panic. The correspondent from the Daily Mail wrote, quote, "Beneath that strong, square-hewn face, you tell the brain is working as if packed in ice. He sat solid on his horse and bent his brow towards the Green Flag. He saw everything, knew what to do, knew how to do it, did it. All saw him and knew they were being nursed to triumph. A young cavalry officer present that day, Winston Churchill, was among many who believed that MacDonald and his Sudanese troops were the real heroes of the Battle of Omdurman, and not General Kitchener, the overall commander. MacDonald returned to Britain a hero, especially in his native Scotland. Civic receptions were held in his honour, including at Edinburgh City Council. Bands greeted him with Handel's great anthem, "See the Conquering Hero Comes." Enthusiastic crowds gathered to cheer one of their own. In the town of Invergordon, men pulled his carriage through the streets as a mark of respect. And in the far north, banners written in Gaelic welcomed their hero home. Down in London, he was enthusiastically mentioned in debates in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords in Parliament. After a brief spell in India, where the Gaelic and English-speaking MacDonald seemed to have developed a skill for actually learning local languages, he was off to the last great war of Queen Victoria's reign, the Second Boer War in South Africa. The British commander in South Africa, Lord Roberts, who had propelled MacDonald's career all those years ago in Afghanistan, gave the 46-year-old command of the Highland Brigade, with the local rank of Major General. Restoring their morale after the mauling that they had received during Black Week, the Highland Brigade under their Highland warrior were to play a key role in the capture of General Prinsloo and 4,000 Boer fighters in the Orange Free State. By now, Roberts had departed and the new Commander-in-Chief in South Africa was MacDonald's commander at Omdurman, Herbert Kitchener. Despite the fact that there was still a war ongoing in South Africa with the guerrilla campaign by the Boers, Kitchener seemed less than keen to have MacDonald around on the scene, and he was posted to India. Many believe that a jealous Kitchener had never forgiven MacDonald for stealing some of the limelight from his victory at Omdurman. And that could be true. Even after the Battle of Omdurman, there were comments in the press showing surprise that Fighting Mac had not received the honours that other officers had gained. There was another possible motive, and we'll come back to that in a short while. Knighted for his services, Sir Hector MacDonald was now appointed as an aide-de-camp or military secretary to Queen Victoria herself. Not bad for a Gaelic-speaking son of a crofter. He had hoped his next appointment would be the Commander-in-Chief in Australia, but instead he was given command of the British troops in the colony of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. There, this no-nonsense son of a crofter fell foul of the colonial elite. He instilled a level of discipline into the local militia which the sons of colonists irked. They wanted to play soldiers, not really be soldiers. He shunned invitations to attend white colonial functions, preferring to spend time with Sinhalese locals. And once he famously shouted at the governor of the colony, Sir Joseph West Ridgway, to get off his parade ground. All endearing to common soldiers and probably to our 21st century society, but at the time, a great way to alienate yourself from the powers that be. Rumours started to circulate within the upper class colonial society that MacDonald seemed to be taking a rather too keen interest in some young boys and patronising a club with seemingly dubious morals. This whispering campaign reached a climax when a colonial tea planter told Governor Ridgway that he had surprised Major General MacDonald in a railway carriage in a rather compromising position with 4 local Sinhalese boys. And suddenly an avalanche of rumours descended on the governor. He confronted MacDonald with these accusations and said that he had over 70 witnesses to MacDonald's behaviour. Interestingly, whilst homosexuality was illegal in Britain and Oscar Wilde had famously been sent to prison only a few years earlier, it wasn't actually a crime in Ceylon. Nevertheless, Ridgway suggested to MacDonald that he return to Britain for a cooling-off period. Upon his return to London, he met his old mentor, Field Marshal Lord Roberts, now Commander-in-Chief of all British forces. And Roberts advised MacDonald to return to Ceylon and face a court-martial to clear his name. The new king, Edward VII, supposedly told him to put a gun to his head rather than face the shame of a military career ruined by proven homosexual conduct. MacDonald decided to return to Ceylon, En route via Paris, he checked into the Hotel Regina. On the morning of the 25th of March 1903, in room 105, Major General Sir Hector MacDonald, hero of the Battle of Omdurman, shot himself through the head. He was just 50 years old. When his body was discovered, a copy of the New York Tribune lay close by, with a lurid story about his time in Ceylon. Were the stories true? I mean, maybe they were just vicious rumours peddled by people who disliked a commoner arriving in the rarefied atmosphere of the Victorian upper classes. And that is certainly a neat story. You know, Victorian British toffs hound a talented commoner to his death. Within just a few years, in fact, a member of Parliament for his home constituency, Ross and Cromarty, Scotland, a man called James Galloway Weir, was claiming that MacDonald had been, to quote, driven to his doom by a society clique. Equally, maybe MacDonald was a homosexual. Some have argued that the reason that Kitchener had him removed from South Africa had less to do with jealousy over Omdurman and more because he had been told that MacDonald had formed an attachment with a young Boer prisoner. Whether there was an elitist conspiracy or whether MacDonald was a homosexual, Scotland was sent into a state of shock and grief at the loss of their hero. When the British authorities suggested that he be buried in Paris, there was an outcry in Scotland, "Bring our son home." And so he was. It was now that another secret emerged from MacDonald's life. Hector MacDonald had been married for 16 years. Back in 1886, while stationed at Edinburgh Castle, he had married Christina MacDonald Duncan, who was 15 years his junior. Since that date, they'd actually only met 4 times. No one really knows what was going on with this marriage. Neither Christina nor Hector actually arrived to register their marriage in the official records in Edinburgh. And the register itself notes that their details were inserted by the registrar himself. Christina had borne him a son, Herbert, 2 years after their marriage. So, was it a marriage of convenience or was it a mistake? We really don't know. But now, after all these years, Christina stepped in to organise a very private funeral at Dean Cemetery in Edinburgh. Despite the fact that Hector MacDonald was not given a hero's funeral, the people of Scotland gave him a hero's send-off. Over 30,000 lined the route to the cemetery for this private funeral. And over the following 3 days, over 90,000 Scots, men, women and children filed past his grave, forming a queue 3 miles long. As I said earlier, I've wanted to tell this story of Hector MacDonald fighting Mac for some time, and I'm really grateful to all of you who've written to me requesting that I do so. Men rising from the ranks to become officers is not uncommon in the British Army, but even now it's not an everyday occurrence. For it to happen in class-ridden Victorian society was even more remarkable. There were others. Colour Sergeant Bourne from Rorke's Drift is a good example. The fact that Hector MacDonald made it all the way to Major General makes him one of a very elite group of men. But the fact that he came from the lowliest of backgrounds to accomplish this achievement is not just impressive, it's actually quite inspiring. Mentioned 11 times in dispatches, his battle honours, quite frankly, are like a commentary of the British Army in the 19th century. But there is that other story too. A story of petty jealousies of senior officers like Kitchener and from an establishment who disliked an outsider and would do anything to bring him down. And I'm sure that makes many of you, even to think about it, quite angry. But maybe the story is actually a lot sadder than that. It's a story of a brave, talented soldier who paid the price for genuinely being gay in a world where homosexuality was frowned upon, where at the end of the day it could shame a brave hero into taking his own life in a Paris hotel room. MacDonald's story is not told enough, but if you seek it, you will find that his legend and his name lives on. There are 2 memorials close to his hometown in Dingwall, including a baronial sort of style tower that stands 100 feet high. But you don't have to go to the northeast of Scotland to see his memorials. Just pop down to your local supermarket, certainly here in the UK. Look in the coffee section and you will invariably see Camp Coffee Essence with its 19th century looking label of a Highland officer enjoying a cup of coffee in colonial India. Marketing legend says that that officer was modelled on Major General Sir Hector MacDonald. Fighting Mac. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. Loads more videos coming your way very soon, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of them. And until next time, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.